In 1941, while living in exile in Finland, the German playwright Bertolt Brecht wrote a play titled The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui. The play was a satirical allegory depicting the steps of Hitler's rise to power in Germany. The titular character, Arturo Ui, who represents Hitler, is a Chicago mobster in the 1930s, trying to monopolize the cauliflower trade, which he does by eliminating his competitors and enemies, eventually becoming the biggest, baddest mobster in town. The play starts with a prologue, where the entire plot is explained in advance. Brecht wanted people to focus more on the message, rather than what's going to happen next. The title is also a giveaway for Brecht's intended message. What you see could have been prevented, could have been resisted, if only people understood where things were headed. This warning, directed at future generations, is made explicit in the epilogue of the play, which was written after the end of the war and is read out by the actor playing the Hitler analog. If we could learn to look instead of gawking, we'd see the horror in the heart of farce. If only we could act instead of talking, we wouldn't always end up on our arse. This was the thing that nearly had us mastered. Don't yet rejoice in his defeat, you men. Although the world stood up and stopped the bastard, the bitch that bore him is in heat again.
Once all the Germans were warlike and mean, but that couldn't happen again. We taught them a lesson in 1918, and they've hardly bothered us since then.
After the defeat of the Nazis in the Second World War, the four victorious powers took direct control over Germany, dividing it between themselves. In each of these areas, the respective powers all began implementing distinct but related policies of denazification. The most well-known examples of these are the Nuremberg trials, where top Nazi officials were tried and in many cases executed for their crimes. But by the end of the war, the Nazi Party had around 9 million members. Trying all of them in court would be logistically impossible. So alongside these trials, the Allies worked on re-educating the population in order to dispel Nazism, not just politically, but also from people's minds and hearts. Road names were changed, monuments were dismantled, citizens were taken to see mass graves and Nazi atrocities firsthand, and teachers and university professors were vetted and retrained, to name just a few measures. With that said, some Nazi officials did re-emerge, especially in West Germany. One notable example is Kurt Georg Kiesinger, a member of the Nazi Party since 1933 and deputy head of the broadcasting and propaganda departments of the Minister of Interior, who became Chancellor of West Germany in the late 60s. Officially, denazification ended in 1951, partly because the task proved incredibly difficult, but also because of the rise of the Cold War, where the focus for Western powers became anti-communism and opposition to the Soviet Union. Many claim, however, that denazification achieved its goals and that Germany was thus able to rejoin the world of nations, and trusted that it would never engage in such atrocities ever again. As Friedrich Taylor, a British historian of modern Germany, remarks, after 1945, this recipe for the reconstruction and rehabilitation of the defeated nations was, with hindsight and in the longer term, a success. All we need to do is look at 21st century Germany. Fast forward to today, and a lot of people are questioning the premise that Germany was actually denazified. With the specter of fascism growing around the globe, far-right parties in Germany, like Alternative für Deutschland, which run on explicitly anti-migrant and ultra-nationalist platforms, have made huge gains in recent elections. Hate crimes and violent assaults by far-right groups and individuals is also at an all-time high. Well, at least since 1945. With that, there's been so much normalization of very dehumanizing sentiments against migrants in Germany. On top of all of that, the German government is a faithful ally to the State of Israel, militarily, diplomatically, and ideologically. Germany still remains the second largest arms exporter to the State of Israel, even while other European states are moving to halt sales and sanction Israeli politicians. To the Germans, defending Israel, no matter what it does, is described as their reason of state, or Staatsräson. In its moment of genocide against Palestinians, the Israelis can always rely on Germany's continuous support. So much for never again. All of this has also shifted the center far to the right. Even center-left parties cannot veer from this line when it comes to Israel. Also, I don't know if many of you have seen footage of police brutality against protesters who stand in solidarity with Palestine, but it's atrocious, and some of the most violent crackdowns I've seen by any European police. And even though public opinion seems to suggest that most people in Germany are opposed to the genocide, it seems for the most part that people are happy to just look the other way. All these realities combined have brought people to the point of asking, have the Germans learned anything from their history? Was Germany actually denazified? If not, why not? And if so, what does it even mean if they're still capable of doing what they're doing today? I think this is puzzling a lot of people, but I've found an allegory, a story that many of you already know, that I think sheds so much light on what De-Nazification amounted to, and ultimately what went wrong. A Clockwork Orange is usually read as a meditation on human morality and governments' attempts to control our most base instincts. But I think the film becomes much more interesting and much more useful when read a bit more specifically, when read in the context of German fascism and the Allies' attempts to eliminate it. I'm not saying that that's what Kubrick or even Burgess, the writer of the original story, intended. What I am saying is that if viewed through this lens, I think the story can reveal a great deal about why denazification never actually happened. In a way, it also foretells the return of fascism that we're seeing today. So obviously, it's a very well-known film, but I don't actually recommend it to people because, well, it's very intense. So what I'll do is give a very brief, very safe overview of the film before then going into the analysis. But before I do that, hello. Welcome to the third video essay of this channel. I hope you appreciate the work I do. I hope you like this video. If you do, there's a number of ways you can support to help me make more of them. Obviously, like and subscribe. This is YouTube, it's just standard. Helps boost whatever, gives you notifications for my next videos, etc., etc. But if you want to go the extra mile, if you really want to help me make more videos, then consider supporting me in one of three ways. Become a member of my channel, which is, I think, the lowest tier is like $3 a month. I will do eventually like members only videos, but for the time being, it's just a way of supporting me financially. You can give me money in the chat below. There's like a super thanks. Or head over to my tip jar, which is ko-fi.com/amonmac. It'll be in the description below. And yeah, would greatly appreciate any and all support. And with that said, let's get on with the video. I think going through the film, You probably see what I'm talking about in terms of the story being an analogy for German fascism and the question, did denazification actually happen? I was cured all right is, to me, very analogous to where we see Germany today. As in short, no. Denazification did not happen, or rather, was not successful. Why? Well, I think there are answers in the story itself. Now, firstly, I don't think there's this one-to-one analogy between Alex and Nazism or fascism. I think that'd be very reductive, especially because fascism manifests very differently in different contexts, and is generally regarded as one of the hardest ideologies to define. What I think can be said is that Alex is a personification of violence for its own sake, of a sort of dehumanized and dehumanizing evil. These are definitely core components of any fascism. Now, the next thing is where I think the analogy starts to get very specific. So, when Alex is administered the Ludovico method, the idea is to isolate the impulse to violence from the rest of Alex's psyche and carve it out. This whole thing is an explicit critique of behaviorism, the field of psychology that focuses on learned behavior and the attempts at altering that behavior through reinforcements and punishments. I think the most famous example of behaviorism, although still in its most rudimentary form, is Pavlov's dog, wherein a scientist was able to make a dog salivate just at the sound of a bell ringing. This experiment demonstrated that external stimuli can trigger internal reactions, even if there's no organic link between the two. Behaviorism would reach its peak popularity with a man named B.F. Skinner. Skinner is most famous for his Skinner box, an experimental setup that aimed to demonstrate how specific behaviors can be externally increased or decreased, depending on what forms of reinforcement or punishment are administered. Skinner also wrote a lot about the further implications of his theory of behavioral science. He not only believed that his findings could be applied to human behavior, but that behaviorism can explain the vast majority of human behavior. He also notably explored those ideas as they can be applied to human society as a whole. In 1971, the exact same year A Clockwork Orange came out, Skinner released what would be known as his most ambitious book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. In the book, Skinner advocates for the design of a culture, using his methods of behavioral reinforcement and conditioning. In his own words, a technology of behavior is available which would more successfully reduce the aversive consequences of behavior, proximate or deferred, and maximize the achievements of which the human organism is capable. The control of the population as a whole must be delegated to specialists, to police, priests, owners, teachers, therapists, and so on, with their specialized reinforcers and their codified contingencies. Essentially, the rest of the book, and what the title is referring to, is a kind of lamentation. We could do this, it'd be great, it'd solve all of our problems, if it weren't for all those pesky people complaining about ridiculous things like freedom and dignity. Skinner's theories were, of course, widely criticized, both at a scientific and political level, most notably by Noam Chomsky, who wrote an absolutely brutal essay entitled The Case Against B.F. Skinner. Anthony Burgess, the author of A Clockwork Orange, described Beyond Freedom and Dignity as, quote, one of the most dangerous books ever written. The story of A Clockwork Orange is itself, in large part, a critique of behaviorism. What the story provided was a very tangible, albeit exaggerated, example of Skinner's technology of behavior, in all of its faultiness and cruelty. Actually, one of the few things that's in the book and not in the film is the description of what A Clockwork Orange is. It is, in fact, a metaphor that is a direct criticism of the Ludovico method, and with it, behaviorism. A Clockwork Orange is an organic thing that is mechanical on the inside, which is kind of a contradiction. It cannot exist since it denies the organic internalities of, well, organisms. But the critique is essentially that this is how behaviorists see the organic. This is how they see humans. And therefore, they feel at liberty to tinker with the mechanisms inside. The person in the story who came up with the term is a journalist who is vocally critical of the government's efforts to try to control people through this methodology. That journalist is this guy. Yeah. It's sort of hinted at in the film, but it's definitely not as explicit as it is in the book. So what does all of this have to do with De-Nazification? Well, there are two main things. First, I think there are parallels between the taking of a whole human being and trying to isolate and carve out one undesirable facet of their being, and with taking a whole political, social, national, economic entity and trying to isolate and carve out one undesirable tendency from it. In the former, we're talking about a clockwork human, and in the latter, a clockwork nation. Basically, it's very short-sighted and unrealistic to think that you can weed out fascism from a society where it had taken deep, deep hold by simply removing the top figures and its most brazen followers. The methods used by the occupying powers in Germany dealt almost exclusively with the results of Nazism and not its causes. A few months ago, the Lebanese writer Alain Alameddine wrote an essay entitled "Germany was never denazified. That's why it's siding with Israel today." And in that essay, he writes, "Nazism is not an apolitical criminal impulse, but a criminal political project built on three foundational pillars: the politicization of identity, colonialism, and capitalism. Instead of recognizing the identitarian, colonial, and capitalist relations of power that had enabled Nazism, and implementing a political program that sought to dismantle these relations, the Allies chose to focus on the crimes that had resulted from them. De-Nazification may have occurred, as in the removal of the Nazi Party, its leaders, and its followers, but did de-fascismification happen? If it doesn't target the roots of why fascism became so popular, not just in Europe, but across Europe, then no, it didn't happen. That brings us to the second thing, the administrators. In A Clockwork Orange, the person who institutes the Ludovico method is this man, the government minister, who strikes me as a classic English imperialist nobleman. He may seem civilized, but just don't ask him what he did in the colonies. So who is he, really, to have an objective view of what makes and unmakes a fascist? In the same sense, the powers that administered the policies of denazification were, well, let's just say they were no angels. All of them, without exception, either at home or across their empires, engaged in racial colonization, campaigns of extermination, and wars of conquest. In fact, in many cases, the Nazis actually saw themselves as borrowing from and building off of traditions set by the British and American imperialists before them. In his book, Hitler's American Model, the American writer James Whitman writes, "The Nazis were consumed by the felt imperative to acquire Lebensraum, living space, for an expanding Germany that would engulf the territories to its east, and for generations of German imperialists, and for Hitler himself, the exemplary land empire was the United States of America. In Nazi eyes, the United States ranked alongside the British, to be respected as racial kindred and builders of a great empire. Both were Nordic polities that had undertaken epic programs of conquest. Indeed, as early as 1928, Hitler was speechifying admiringly about the way Americans had gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000, and now keep the modest remnants under observation in a cage. And during the years of genocide in the early 1940s, Nazi leaders made repeated reference to the American conquest of the West when speaking of their own murderous conquest to their east. Whitman also lays out how Nazi race laws, the first and most famous of them being the Nuremberg laws, not to be confused with the Nuremberg trials, were explicitly influenced and modeled after the US's racist Jim Crow laws. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, many Nazis, including not least Hitler himself, took a serious interest in the racist legislation of the United States. Indeed, in Mein Kampf, Hitler praised America as nothing less than the one state that had made progress towards the creation of a healthy racist order of the kind the Nuremberg laws were intended to establish. The administrators of De-Nazification were not anti-fascists, they were just anti-Nazi, because, well, the Nazis were against them, as in, the Nazis were the warmongers. But again, their definition of what fascism is very limited, as in it's just members of the National Socialist Workers' Party. But they seem very willing to ignore the actual constitutive aspects of what makes a fascist. The Ugandan academic Mahmoud Mamdani, yes, the father of Zohran Mamdani, the guy running for mayor of New York, wrote a very concise explanation for why this is. By interpreting Nazism narrowly as a set of crimes committed by Germans, rather than as an expression of nationalism, the Allied powers protected themselves and their citizens from scrutiny, lest they be forced to account for their own nationalist violence at home and in their colonies. Had Nazism instead been understood as a political project, all of these uncomfortable but vital truths would have been on the table, potentially leading to a revolutionary reimagining of modern political organization. And so it's for these reasons, and many more, why it's hard to say that in any meaningful way that Germany was truly denazified. The fundaments of fascism are still there. They are there across Europe, North America, and indeed across the globe. And in many ways, they are in full ascendance at the moment. To me, in a very specific way, I do not see Germans operating from a basis of guilt or shame, as many people claim. Instead, I see a return to form. When I see a German police officer beating up protesters, I don't see a guilty conscience. I see Alex and his gang. I see white men who are overjoyed at the fact that they are able to beat up brown people, queer people, women, and even Jewish people. There's a joy, a giddiness on their face. Finally, they get to relive the glory of their forefathers. I think there's also something to the fact that the only member of Alex's gang who lands a job and is accepted into society is the one who becomes a police officer, which is an ideal job for someone who gets off on acts of ultraviolence. The Germans never really learned their lesson. I think that's evident not just from their fanatic support for Israel's genocide in Gaza, but also because, well, things just kind of moved on. With the onset of the Cold War, all that stuff became old news, and Germany, still split in two, became an important part of this new conflict. Actually, while writing this, I developed a new theory about what "I was cured all right" could potentially mean, especially in the context of this reading. So Alex says the line only after being won over by the minister's offer of a cozy, well-paying job in return for Alex's silence and collaboration. In that moment, Alex, who up until then was an antisocial actor, whose violence was deemed illegitimate and in need of correction, was accepted into society by a government minister, no less. And so what happens, by saying "I was cured" in a kind of sarcastic way, is not to confirm that he is in fact not cured, but that the diagnosis no longer exists. That he was cured because he was invited into the normal civilized world. That he was now deemed legitimate and indeed an asset of the state. And so that's kind of like in the same way how Germany can be considered denazified because it was brought into the fold of the rest of the powers around it, not because it was substantially transformed internally. And with that said, that's all I have to say about A Clockwork Orange and the myth of German denazification. Thank you for making it this far into the video. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you like this video, please consider supporting me to make more videos like this by going to my Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/AmonMac. A link will be in the description below. Any amount will be greatly appreciated. And yeah, I'll see you all in the next one.